Everyone and their mother and their favorite map-carrying baddie has been saying Silksong is significantly harder than Hollow Knight, and I must say, I absolutely agree, although perhaps not as hard as some people are making it out to be. That said, after seeing so many people complaining, pointing out this difficulty, it made me start to think, how exactly is it harder than Hollow Knight? What specific factors make the game harder than Hollow Knight, and are these factors fair and well balanced? That's what we're getting into today, so if this sort of content interests you at all, please consider liking the video and subscribing and all that jazz, and with all that said, let's get baking. Based on Silksong's genre, i.e. a Metroidvania, my thoughts are that there are two core elements of the game that contribute to its difficulty. Of course, there are likely other reasons why the game is more difficult, and some aspects that will overlap between these two categories, but I'm just keeping it general for simplicity's sake and putting the different factors into categories as I see fit. So, what are these categories? Let's go ahead and take this one at a time, starting with a bit of an aerial view. Let's consider one of the biggest differences between the two games, the map and all the different areas therein. Now, we all knew that Silksong was going to be a bigger game than Hollow Knight, or at least we assumed it would be if nothing else. And while it is a great boon due to the increased exploration and variety, there are some inherent challenges to the player that come with it. Difficulty isn't only related to fighting after all, it is all the different factors of a game that make it challenging. Looking at the map of Hallownest, it's certainly nothing to sneeze at. Lots of different areas with plenty of variety. That said, notice how interconnected everything is. All the different areas are pretty close together, and most have at least two entrances, if not more. It's typically pretty easy to get from one end of the map to the other, even without the segways, and especially when you get used to it. Now, we take a look at Farland's map, and holy shit, guys, what were you smoking when you made this? Okay, so maybe it's a little bit bigger. Hey, it's okay, Hallownest, nothing to be ashamed of, we all have different skills. Here's the thing though, every solution creates its own problems. Sure, the map is bigger, but because of that, it becomes significantly more challenging to get from one area to the other, especially because the areas themselves are large. There are several sections that are, at least from what I can tell, about the same size and a similar level of complexity to the Forgotten Crossroads. Sure, the Bellways make it easier, and it's definitely not impossible to get from one end of the map to the other and navigate it well, but especially early game and when you're trying to find maps and stuff, it can be significantly more challenging to navigate just due to the sheer scope. Not to mention, there are certain areas like Sinner's Path and Ant's March where there are challenging areas with stage hazards and hardly any benches. It can be a bit overwhelming when you're scrambling to find a bench and die multiple times, causing major backtracking. That said, these areas are technically optional. They're not gatekeeping the story or progression or anything. However, that's actually kind of another issue. The number of seemingly optional areas. Look, I'll keep it a buck. If you're playing Silksong and you don't want to explore, I don't know why you're playing Silksong. That's kind of a big part of the draw in my opinion. Having said that, speaking as somebody who generally likes to try and get the quote-unquote good or true ending in games, as well as somebody who just generally doesn't like to miss details, by God is it kind of stressful thinking I missed something cool. I mean, for f***'s sake, why do you think I'm making this video when I haven't even beaten the game yet? I'm taking my sweet ass time scouring absolutely everything that I can. And with so many different areas, and without being super clear what is optional and what's not, at least for my purposes, it can be kind of difficult, especially some of the more annoying areas like the one part of Deep Docks where the floor is lava and the platforms crumble and basically every enemy either flies or has explosives or both, and the explosives have physics and are delayed explosions and they deal double damage and the flying things can't be attacked from above and there are no benches. What the sorry about that. My point is, while it is awesome to have so much to explore, the fact the map is so big and labyrinthian and unclear as to what's relevant and what isn't, and whether there are hidden tunnels and whatnot, not to mention that, there might be things that only unlock after backtracking, it can be a bit overwhelming. Of course, if you're just playing straight through the game and only tackling the plot-related stuff like a psychopath, this aspect shouldn't be as difficult for you. Some people have also mentioned how certain areas of platforming or runbacks or things like that add to the difficulty. In general, I don't think it's that drastic of a difficulty increase, all things considered, at least across the whole breadth of the map. That's not to say that there aren't difficult platforming areas, but at least from what I've played so far, it's probably about the same difficulty as Hollow Knight in most places. Maybe the general spread of platforming difficulty is similar to some of the higher difficulty ends of Hollow Knight, but it's not outside of the realm of what was present in that first game. For the most part, you just have to adjust to the new pogo mechanic or get one of the crests that lets you do the more classic downward pogo. But either way, there are ways to adjust to that and it's not outside of the realm of what should be expected. I obviously haven't come across every single challenging platforming area, but if the metric is saying like the last judge run back is super hard or super annoying, I feel like in the grand scheme of things, the majority of the required platforming isn't too bad, at least not bad enough to be presented as some drastic, insane difficulty increase from the original, but that's just me. Now, environment isn't just about the map as a whole and the different difficulties of the locations and whatnot, but also down to the little details such as the battle arenas. There are two different trends I've commonly seen in this game when it comes to the battle arenas. On the one hand, we have the tiny arenas, and on the other, we have the long arenas. The first one is pretty self-explanatory. Small area limits movement, and adding multiple enemies makes it a minefield you need to navigate. Pretty simple as to why it's more difficult. For the other one, however, that one is a bit more interesting to me. There are multiple arenas, like for the Moorwing, that one section of Ants March, the massive skull guy, in the Marrow, whatever, where the area isn't necessarily super tall, but it is super long. The interesting thing about that is how it affects decision making. Rookie or just generally less confident players will instinctually want to run as far away as possible since they have the room and they want space and time to heal. The trade-off with that is the room is so long the enemy can go off screen. Then, for all you know, they're winding up another attack that you can't see that negates the healing that you just did. These arenas give you the option of safe healing if you're willing to take the risk, but they incentivize you to stay close and learn how to actually deal with the enemy choreography so you can be sure to keep them in view and respond a bit better. It adds a layer of choice to the combat that I find pretty interesting and that I think was pretty lacking in Hollow Knight. Most of the arenas in that game were pretty closed off and about the same size, maybe with just some slight variation. Okay, I think that's pretty much it for the environment. Obviously, you could say more about each particular area, but there are so many and there's relatively little one-to-one connection to Hollow Knight that I don't necessarily want to spend too much time on each little specific area. All that said, that's only part of what makes the new game so challenging. So what's the other part then? Well, really, it's the only other part of the game besides exploring, that being combat is a bit of a hard thing to quantify in terms of difficulty sometimes. Sure, the same could be said for environment, but with that, you can typically see a clear progression in difficulty with certain areas, like adding more stage hazards or enemies or making it more confusing or whatever. For fights, some people have the most trouble with the last boss, and some people might have the most trouble with the first. What's super difficult for some people is going to be an absolute breeze for others. So in that sense, it makes it almost kind of difficult to judge exactly what makes a fight difficult. However, that said, I do think that there are a few ways I can quantify the difficulty of the combat, especially in relation to Hollow Knight. The first element, the one that pretty much everybody has complained about, is the number of enemies that do double damage. Now, having enemies do 2 damage instead of 1 is obviously quantifiably more challenging since it takes fewer hits to kill you. That said, in the early game at least, I think they actually balance this out pretty well. But Blake, isn't having enemies do more damage just artificially inflating the difficulty? In many cases, I would agree, but here's why I think it at least somewhat works in Silksong. Now, what exactly does double damage do in terms of affecting the player? What is the actual outcome in terms of the gameplay and the impact? For one, when you get hit with double damage, it's a louder noise, which obviously is a bit more jarring. And two, if it's your first time getting hit, or often even if it's not, it's super jarring as well because you're thinking, oh crap, he does multiple damage. The impact of these elements in tandem is to make the player feel one thing: panic. When you get hit with more damage than you were expecting, or have some kind of cue that can throw you off, it immediately sets you into panic/stress mode, and when you're panicking, you typically make worse decisions. There are also enemies like the Moorwing that deal 2 damage, but they deal it in the form of back-to-back single damage. In terms of effect, it's the exact same thing, you lose the same amount of health, but having damage be dealt back-to-back makes it feel more like you're trapped. And if you're focused on scrambling to get out of there, your head isn't as much in the game. It's basically the same thing that leads to panic rolling in Soulsborns. Considering this, it makes you realize that the battle not only becomes about learning the enemy choreography and dodging accordingly, but also about managing your emotions and keeping your cool. To support this, look at some of the enemies in Silksong early and mid-game that deal 2 damage. We have this random skull enemy that has only 1 attack, a slow tackle, the Bell Beast that essentially has 2 moves. I mean, it has a 3rd move, but that's also kind of a stage hazard, so We have the Savage Beastfly that has only 2 moves, the Big Ant that has 2 moves, the Giant Golem that has 2 moves, etc. With most of the enemies that deal 2 damage, they're either stage hazard enemies that throw bombs or something, or otherwise they're enemies with a very limited number of moves. Having simple enemies deal more damage helps players learn/adjust to the new mechanics, get good at studying movesets, and practice timing their heals, but in addition to that, it provides actual consequences. I mean, think of how trivial the Bell Beast would be if it only did 1 damage the majority of the time. With the new healing mechanic especially, you could pretty much damage boost through the entire battle with little trouble. Adding 2 damage creates stakes, but it doesn't make it unfair in this case because it's not expecting an unreasonable amount from the player. It's the reason why most of the Widow's attacks don't deal 2 damage, at least from my memory. Her moveset is pretty complex, so that's sort of the reverse. Instead of having simple attacks that deal a lot of damage, it has mostly complex attacks that deal single damage, so it's more about the dance rather than high tense, avoiding simple attacks to avoid damage. Yeah, there are other enemies like the Last Judge that have a bit more complex of a moveset and still do 2 damage, but that's also notably farther into the game. In general, while it's certainly used a lot more than in Hollow Knight, double damage is generally used in reasonable places in Silksong. However, one place where I don't think it works is with stage hazards. I feel strongly that stage hazards should only deal 1 damage. Like, maybe in rare occasions if it's lava or certain saw blades, it could deal 2, whatever. But in general, with a game so heavily reliant on platforming and pogoing or things like that, punishing the player that severely for trying to figure out the proper path, especially on runbacks, is just a level of difficulty that will only lead to frustration. But that's not about the combat, so it's kind of its own thing. If anything, that should have been an environment. But just the idea of platforming dealing 2 damage is the one thing where I think it's my biggest knock against the game. So, putting that aside, we've demonstrated that the damage itself isn't necessarily game-breaking. So what about the enemy movement and choreography in general? Well, I can say with confidence that at minimum, the basic enemy intelligence and response is generally more complicated than in Hollow Knight, at least on average. Consider some of the peon enemies in Hollow Knight. They either just run at you, wave a nail haphazardly at you, shoot things at you in a straight and consistent way, whatever. In general, they're all really simple one-on-one and do very little to respond to or trouble the player. Some might dodge out of the way every now and then, but only so often and usually not super immediately responsive, at least from my memory. In Silksong, on the other hand, haha, f*** you! But seriously though, so many enemies are actually troublesome in Silksong, even just the basic ones. There are still many that are pushovers and hey, you need fodder to get silk and rosaries from, but there's also a ton that have actually challenging movesets. Hell, this one Ant Soldier essentially has Hornet's moveset from the first battle in Hollow Knight, just maybe minus 2 signature moves. Flying enemies in Silksong are also significantly more liable to move out of your way and keep attacking you from a distance, so you really need to draw them in. I've also lost count of the number of times I've tried to skip an enemy on a run back by dodging over them, only for them to backstep the literal second I do and it makes me land on them and take damage. In general, the combat becomes much more about waiting for the right time to strike and baiting the enemies and responding accordingly, which I honestly feel fits Hornet to a T. There are also multiple enemies in different areas that have lingering attacks, so you also need to be careful about where you step. I'm pretty sure that was in Hollow Knight too, but these ones have physics, so you need to actually somewhat predict where they'll go, including these stupid bombs from these stupid f***s in Deep Docks. I hate you so much. Sorry, again, I'm just having a bit of trouble with them at the time of writing this. Other than the enemies being smarter in terms of how they move and dodge though, let's look at 2 examples where the movement of the enemy itself is what makes it difficult. Specifically this fat little Scraw and Savage Beastfly. I simultaneously hold these 2 in equally low esteem while also kind of respecting Team Cherry for the cojones they had in making them. I mean, they saw how much people vehemently hated Primal Aspid to the point where it became a meme, and then they just made Primal Aspid, but worse. The thing that makes Squat Craw difficult is something that makes any sort of in-game combat difficult: unpredictability. You see, he flies like Primal Aspid does to an extent, and you can even parry his attacks, but where Primal Aspid at least flew consistently and stayed in one place for at least a second or 2 at a time, this corpulent asshole bobs up and down at inconsistent intervals, meaning not only do you need to time your hits between his attacks, but you also need to time it so you don't misjudge the distance and accidentally just run into him. Not only that, if you try to attack from underneath him for too long, he could just land on you. I can't even hate Team Cherry for this. They doubled down, and in retrospect, after fighting way too many of these, I honestly think it's kind of hilarious. As for Savage Beastfly, for him, it's much more of a I respect it feeling. I mentioned earlier that he only has 2 moves, a tackle and a slam. He can also summon allies, but I don't technically count that as an attack per se, it's more just a bonus move. So if he only has 2 moves, why is he so challenging for me and for basically everybody else who's fought him? Well, from what I can tell, that is the result of one very subtle yet very brilliant little detail that I haven't seen people talking about that much. And maybe I'm the only one who had trouble with it, but hear me out. You see, as he winds up to tackle, he actually takes longer than you would expect compared to the rest of the game. Most other enemies in Silksong have pretty short telegraphs, so you need to be pretty ready to respond at any given time. With Savage Beastfly though, he takes a bit longer, and during that time, he will continue to shift position while winding up. As such, if you jump too early, i.e. try to preemptively dodge it as you have been so conditioned, he will shift his position ever so slightly so that he catches you at the exact wrong place. You're too low to hover over him with the modified dress, and you're too high to properly get to the ground before he hits you. You're just caught in the middle. Also, when you fight him at this point, you probably don't have double jump. I can see that being a way to mitigate that, but I doubt people will wait that long. As such, the way to deal with it is, compared to other enemies, you need to wait until he actually starts moving. And while yeah, he doesn't move too fast, so it's not an impossible task, that also adds some inherent difficulty because it shortens your reaction window. I frankly have to respect how such a little detail in an otherwise brain-dead simple attack could cause me and others that much trouble. Although, I will say, for all the people complaining about his summons and such, yeah, that's still a bit annoying, and I think they still kind of summon too many at some times, but once you realize that you can bait him into taking them out with his slam attack, it becomes a lot easier, and I feel like that's just another tool that helps balance out the fight a little bit. Personally, my theory is that while this fight is by no means easy, I think the biggest thing that frustrates people, whether subconsciously or not, is that based on his appearance and the general vibe of the arena, it feels like it should be easier, but it's not, and that makes people way more frustrated because it's deceptively tricky, but that's just my theory at least. The key with enemies like Squat Craw and Savage Beastfly is that these types of enemies, i.e. ones that significantly mess up the combat rhythm, are few and far between. Most enemies have a pretty distinct pattern and rhythm, aside from maybe the flying enemies, because those are just always annoying even in Hollow Knight. And all the boss fights I've done so far have consistent moves that one can absolutely adapt to and predict. It's not necessarily just RNG. These sorts of enemies just help shake things up a bit to make the player not too dependent on their rhythm or impulses they've built up, so I think they serve a necessary purpose. Okay, so we've gone over damage, enemy response, and movement in terms of combat. To close out this section, I want to take the liberty of doing a full but brief analysis of a pretty well-known and well-maligned boss fight in the somewhat early game to see all the different techniques come together, as well as a general example of how Team Cherry likes to design their boss fights, that enemy being the Moorwing. This is a boss that many people have expressed difficulty with, and it definitely took me a few tries myself. That said, it is by no means unfair, and from what I can tell, is actually quite well implemented. Let's go piece by piece here, starting with the layout of the arena. This is one of the two options I mentioned previously where the arena is quite large and long and you're able to run pretty far away from the boss. Not to mention in this case you can actually leave the arena, but I digress. However, the thing with this is that, like I said before, if you run too far away, the boss will go off screen and you can no longer see what it's doing. On multiple attempts, I would run away from the boss to heal or something and then come back and run headfirst into a dash that I did not have time to dodge because guess what? I couldn't see it coming. Therefore, part of the fight becomes about risk management. Are you willing to risk getting hit by an attack you're not prepared for to gain ample time to heal? Or, as the fight incentivizes you to do, will you stay close to the enemy so you can see everything it does, limiting the distance and time you have to heal? This is like how Soulsborns incentivize you to be aggressive and, roll laterally and forward and punish backpedaling too much. The goal is to really make you learn the moveset so you don't need to run away too much to begin with. Now, let's look at how the Moorwing's actual moves progress throughout the battle. When it starts, he only has 3 attacks. A dash that's pretty easy to jump over, a blade throw that's pretty easy to jump over, and a swipe attack that's pretty clearly telegraphed. All but the dash attack do 2 consecutive single damage, which instigates that trapped and panicked feeling I mentioned earlier, but are still pretty easy to dodge. In the second phase, it's a natural evolution. There's one added move that's very clearly telegraphed but slightly harder to dodge, an evolution of the throw move that adds another blade so it becomes slightly harder to dodge, and the rest stays basically the same. This ramps up the difficulty, but not unreasonably so. It's a natural progression to shake things up. The real kicker with this fight though, and the one that tripped me up the most until I figured it out, is how it breaks your rhythm. In the first phase, his dash has no follow-up and creates an ample attack window if you chase after him, which you get accustomed to. However, in the next phase, this time when he dashes, at the end, he immediately turns around and throws a blade out at you. At first, I thought it was inconsistent and I was just getting unlucky since it's not like it's a different attack I hadn't seen before. However, once I realized he just did that every single time, it became easy to account for. But you see what happened. The fight established a rhythm and a consistent opening, but then subverted that once you got comfortable with it. It made you develop a rhythm and then broke said rhythm, so you had to adjust. But it's not unfair because it is very clearly telegraphed and consistent. This, in my opinion, in general, is a really well-balanced boss fight. Easy to comprehend but crucial to avoid moves, natural progression and move variation, a unique arena that factors into your decision making, and high but not ludicrous stakes because the run back isn't super far away or anything. As far as boss fights go, it has everything you could want, except maybe not as much agility as some, but I think that's just the type of boss fight it is. Especially considering where it's at in the game, I think it's fine. All in all, Silksong is absolutely quantifiably harder than Hollow Knight because it increases the scope and complexity of the map, alternates the layout of the arenas, increases the intelligence / skill / pathing whatever of most enemies, adds stakes with higher damage in key places to force the player to maintain focus and not panic, and adds a certain degree of inconsistency with certain enemies to throw off the player's rhythm. All that said, is the game too difficult? No. Mostly. Yeah, okay, I'll admit there are some really annoying elements. Having pretty much all stage hazards do double damage, like I said, was a really odd and really poor choice in my opinion. I understand being punishing, but when there are a solid number of relatively intense platforming sections, many of which are pretty grueling to run back themselves, it just feels a bit excessive. You can make some of them do double damage, but it definitely shouldn't be the majority. Also, there are some enemy gauntlet rooms that feel a bit excessive. Like, I'm not against the gauntlets of smaller enemies in different phases and whatnot. It's a nice little shake up to the challenge and makes a good lead up to a boss or a certain area, but I feel like Team Cherry gets a little gratuitous with them in some places. There's one specifically area of Citadel that it feels like they could have dropped 1 or 2 rounds of that and it would have been more fair and less of a slog. It is, I will say, kind of hard to balance out my criticism that's born out of frustration, like on my personal end from the valid criticism, but I do feel like it's fair to say that some enemy rush rooms could use 1 or 2 less stages. Even if it made it slightly too easy for some people, it would just make it less of a slog because they take so long by default. Other than that though, pretty much all the major or required fights I've done so far feel well balanced progression-wise and pretty fair. Like, I've thought of some bosses as easier than others, but in general they have a pretty consistent scale up, and I can easily see some people having an easier time with some than others, but it's at least a clear progression and adds variety, like the difference between the Last Judge and the Clockwork Dancers. Like, you might find the latter one easier than the former or vice versa, but you can't deny that they are significantly different in terms of style. As I mentioned before, in the name of full transparency, I haven't beaten the game as of writing this. I'm currently in Act 2, making my way through the Citadel and exploring areas that I didn't have access to previously. That said, I do feel like I've made my way through enough of the game to notice some consistencies and point out exactly how it differs from Hollow Knight. Anyway, go ahead and let me know in the comments if you agree or disagree with my thoughts. I just kind of want to consolidate the stuff that I have seen as I've been playing the game and sort of give an actual concrete answer as to what people have been saying, because for me, I don't know, I just kind of saw people saying that it was hard, and then it just made me think, okay, well, why is it hard? And what's the distinction between being hard in a fair way and telling people that they need to get good, or what's hard in an unfair way? And I think looking at the actual bottom line, the specific details that make Silksong harder, I think in general it's still a pretty fair, just challenging experience. I think Team Cherry cooked with this game, but I can understand why some people might not like it. Either way, I'm excited to explore it to the fullest, and I'm also excited for anything else that they might potentially cook up in the future, even if it wasn't Hollow Knight related. Other than that, I think that's it. Please have a good day. Like I said, let me know what you think. Subscribe if you can. And other than that, I'll see you next time, Bakers. Peace.